Good. So this is the payment panel, and it's moving a lot right now. I don't know if you read on TechCrunch this morning, Adyen, which is a company that processes payment for Spotify, Airbnb, and also games on Facebook, just raised $250 million. So yeah, that's very huge. And let's start with a quick tour of what are your companies doing.
Sure. My name is Bhattacharya. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Zipmark. What Zipmark does is we enable businesses to make or accept payments from their bank account. So we're not a credit card processor. We actually work with companies that issue invoices and bills and need to get paid from those. Think of things that you use a check or a wire transfer or ACH to pay for today. And we enable those businesses to do so online with a fully embeddable API and interface to do that from their website. And we also offer a couple of off-the-shelf applications that they can configure for themselves. So totally away from the card processing and retail space, strictly on the services payments. We also enable payments in reverse when a business has to do disbursements in a high volume. So think of the Uber of XYZ industry, which is, seems to be, there are 4 companies like that getting funding on a daily basis. Each one of those is creating a disbursement problem for themselves. And we provide for them a simple way to get to know the people that they want to disperse to and to get those payments out to them in a streamlined, reliable, and effective way.
So it's like an online checkbook that transfers money within a day, right?
Yes, we've never described it that way, but yeah, I mean, in a large part, what we're providing is a gateway to the banking system that is actually understandable and that provides you rational feedback as opposed to putting instructions into a black hole. And this is particularly a problem for startups and small businesses because when you go to a bank, and I'm an ex-banker, small businesses are treated like, the worst kind of client, right? Because, you charge them as many fees as possible and give them the least amount of services. So what we look to do is to provide these companies with a way, to get access to services to help them grow and essentially treat them like the next big company as opposed to a small company.
Hi, my name is Mark. I'm one of the co-founders of Cover. Cover is an application that you can have on your phone. You can walk into a great restaurant, have a nice meal, and when you're done, just walk right out. You don't have to wait for the check. Everything just gets emailed right to your phone.
So mobile payments for restaurants.
Yeah.
Cool. So as I see, we have one person, Jay, representing more the B2B side, and Mark representing B2C. Maybe it would be interesting that you both share your vision and your perception of the landscape of the payments in each of those industries.
Sure. So what's missing also is peer-to-peer, which sort of neither of us do. We had a sort of a brief chat about it. It's not that we're not particularly, sort of excited about it. It's just that peer-to-peer is a very common thing for people to build, a very hard thing to actually succeed at. But I looked at the mobile payment space from a consumer perspective, and I saw that Apple Pay, Google Wallet, all these things are sort of brewing, but we are a very, very long way away from Americans actually buying things in retail outlets on their phone, right? That Western Europe, Eastern Asia, even North Africa and the Middle East are much, much further along the mobile payments landscape, at least from a B2C perspective, right? And so we decided at Cover to build a single merchant vertical. We chose restaurants for a number of reasons, one of which is historical. Credit cards got started in fine dining restaurants here in Manhattan with Diners Club. But if you think about sort of the size of various payment markets, sort of in-person payments is about the $7 trillion market, which seems like a lot until you look at like mortgages, which is like a $15 trillion market. And then you look at like direct deposit, which is like, I think 40 trillion, right? And so we are doing a $660 billion restaurant market, which is really just a fraction of the overall market. So a lot of exciting stuff is also happening on the B2B side, where it's not as if people don't have payments at all. Obviously, people are paying and receiving goods. But there's so much that can be sort of changed and disrupted when done well. I'm obviously going to let Jay talk about that. He knows it a lot better than I do.
Thank you. I think from our perspective, the way that we look at B2B payments is that it's an under-addressed area of innovation. I think that, from what I have seen, a lot of the early venture money and a lot of the early private equity went into the consumer-facing side of payments. There's a ton of what I would call sort of over-innovation around retail payments, and there's certainly a mounting body count going on around that. So we took a look at this and said, what really is under addressed here, and where is there, like you said, Mark, trillions of dollars that are just being serviced today by things like wire transfers and paper checks. And we felt like that was where a replacement was needed, and that was where we could build something that we could understand the requirements for and deliver to those businesses, and drive metrics that they understand.
So we see it's a very, very huge industry, but it just started moving faster and faster. It's going from a very slow period. Why is that?
Yeah, that's one of the things that I've been very lucky to kind of see directly, because I spent 8 years at Citigroup in their innovation group, setting up their venture capital practice and watching this happen, through the early part of the 2000s. And what's happened more recently is just the democratization of certain resources in the financial services sector. Before this, you had to go to one of 5 companies to get any kind of financial solution. Now you've got 500 companies that you can go to if you're a particular type of businesses. We're talking about verticalization. We're talking about specificity around solutions, which is great, right? We're no longer in a Coke and Pepsi world. You can get Snapple diet green tea if that's what you want. And I think that's a function of technology. I think that's a function of banks starting to hit the plateau in terms of their own ability to grow. And so they're looking at alternative vectors to actually affect their P&Ls. And I think that overall, we're seeing financial activity taking a massive shift from online to mobile. When I started at the bank, nobody thought that anybody would apply for a credit card or a mortgage online. And they literally gave that P&L, which at the time was very, very small in 2002, to the young guys, because the older guys didn't want to risk their bonuses. So in 2 years, we turned that in the cards franchise at Citigroup, we turned that into over 50% of the online acquisitions. So clearly what we're seeing here is a massive shift, and that shift is being addressed in terms of capabilities.
Yeah, and I think all of these are good points. I think sort of supplementing that is the rise of developer tools to make it easier for small companies just to hit the ground running. When we started coverage 2.5 years ago, within 3 weeks of quitting my last job, we actually had live customers in a restaurant paying on our rails. And that's sort of like a ridiculous thing to think about. That, first of all, that I don't know, like, trust me. But like putting that aside, that like within under a month, you could build a whole payment network, right? Like, small though it is, resting on top of the existing credit card network, but that we didn't have to go and set up a deal with either Wells Fargo or Chase Payment Tech or any of the large payment acquirers. So we could literally just have off-the-shelf stuff to build it ourselves. And so because of that, you have all of these small companies coming out of nowhere, doing either vertical approaches, doing very hyper-local approaches, combining mobile with all sorts of other things that like are creating something interesting. Whether any of them succeed, I think we all agree, this is a field that is littered with corpses of failed startups, many of which raised incredible amounts of money to just crash and burn. And while there's some high-profile ones like that are currently in a death spiral, like Pay by Touch was one of the biggest failures of the last bubble, right? Like, payments generally have some of the biggest failures, the biggest, brightest, and most embarrassing failures, right? Like, in this space. And so sort of this is a caveat emptor. Don't go into payments or think about payments without realizing most investors have been burned at least once.
And on the customer side, Mark, what do you think is gonna trigger the end users to actually start paying only with their phones?
So paying only with your phones is just not sort of that practical. I know people who try to like only take Ubers and only like use sort of frictionless payments, and like other than like making a good Medium post, you don't really like live your life that way. But at the same time, right, huge network effects are required to get enough merchant buy-in to get ubiquity. And two-sided markets are hard, right? Like, payments is a classically hard marketplace. You need to have it for at least consumer-facing stuff. You need enough customers to make it worthwhile for the merchants to either invest in or upgrade their hardware and software. You need enough merchants for consumers to download these apps and like make it worth their while. And like I said, everyone has payment systems, right? Like, no one's just sitting around with money going, I wish there was something I could do with money, right? Like, people have this, things are working. So for new, companies, for startups, for new businesses, it might be easier to get in on the ground floor, but convincing people that there is enough consumer demand to not have supply constraints, this is just hard. Bootstrapping a two-sided market is hard. We generally think an extreme vertical approach in a hierarchical vertical like restaurants where there is some social proof. When we walk into a restaurant, we say we work with Momofuku, they pay a lot more attention. If we say I work with 7 restaurants you've never heard of. But other than those kinds of markets, it's just generally quite hard.
And how much do you think Apple Pay is going to help, and how about Bitcoins and beacons?
So generally, Apple Pay is great for companies like mine because the more Americans pay with their phone at retail, the more awkward it will be when they don't have that option. And you're never going to use Apple Pay in a sit-down restaurant. They're not going to walk up to you with a tablet at 11 Madison Park and say, now touch your phone here. Nor are you going to hand your phone to a waiter who's going to walk away with it. We chose something where just NFC is not an option. So the more people pay, the sort of easier that hurdle gets to jump. Bitcoin, I think this year has not been a great year for Bitcoin, both in terms of valuation, in terms of press, in terms of volume. I think we could have multiple panels on the value long-term of Bitcoins in the blockchain. I'm just going to punt on that, unless somebody else wants to pick that up. Beacons are great. Look, your phone has all these sensors. It's incredibly smart. There's more computing power than it took to put somebody on the moon. You're crazy not to use everything that you have when a customer walks in to know exactly who they are, where they are, do some of the authentication and authorization for a payment, right? Like, this is one of the reasons developers are super excited about all of these sensors. And we use beacons. I know downtown uses beacons. I think they're actually a wonderful thing, and I'm hoping they're just getting better.
I think that, as a slightly above average consumer of payment services, I still think that all of the things that you just asked about still have to prove to me why I need to use it. I can't think of a valid reason why I would use Bitcoin to do a damn thing, right? I used Apple Pay a lot the first week I got my phone. Now I only use it in taxis, and I'm in a yellow taxi only when Uber is at like 3x, right? So, and that's because we choose our payment type, and there's this concept called wallet share in payments that hasn't transferred over to these new types. There's a lot of excitement around new modes of payments, but you still have to convince someone to do that instead of using their Amex card or using their cashback credit card or using the debit card from Charles Schwab where they save money on ATM fees or whatever the case may be. These are really well developed theses around how to get a consumer to choose your particular payment type over another when they're making that choice at the point of sale. And I think that those kinds of things will come into play over the course of the next 12 to 18 months as we look at rewards programs and things like that drive sort of retail preference. And we'll see how that plays out.
In an idealistic world, what do you think the payment industry should look like?
So we have like perhaps the opposite of that right now. So I think it's sort of safe to say that like you can track going all the way back to like Andrew Jackson vetoing the second Bank of the US to just no good payment infrastructure in America for generations. So I don't know what ideal is. Payments should be dumb rails by and large. You can build value-added services on top of them, but our dumb rails are too dumb, right? Like they're embarrassingly dumb. Like I think Zipmark is great just to like address something like check cashing, right? Like the check cashing infrastructure is just mind-boggling how much that's still done. That is not a modern rail. Modernized rails, keep them as sort of simple tubes, and let people build on top of that is generally the world I would like to live in.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I think that, if you look at the way that broadly disaggregated industries, sort of innovate, it's by verticalizing, and you have to kind of take the inputs, which are today, in the case of payments, owned by banks and their related companies. And you have to make them available to those who are willing to put in the effort to build enough product to solve a particular industry or a particular person's problem. And I think that that's the direction things are going. It's just really slow because they don't need to move. Banks are making tons of money on a daily basis.
Are we talking about months, years, decades, centuries?
I'm hopeful that my kids will see a better payments sort of environment than I see. But it's still really hard to innovate, right? I mean, if you want to go in there and talk about creating a particular application that represents a little bit of risk. Right now, they're dealing with things, and I'll give you an example of what we deal with. We deal with the ACH system, wire transfers, and checks. They've been talking about doing same-day ACH for 10, 15 years. The ACH system is 30 years old. The reason why banks don't ever approve it is because it will eat their wire revenue. You have all these sort of inside baseball problems that are solely owned by the infrastructure owners, and those things are not going to sort themselves out. They have to decide that they're going to promote the next thing.
Let's take one question.
Okay, what questions?
Just one.
No questions?
We bored them, Mark.
We can talk more about
There's
chat.
one.
There's one question.
Just one?
Yep.
I mean, fundamentally, I feel your pain. I mean, it sounds like you come from Europe somewhere, and I can do an Überweisung in Germany, like this anywhere, and it's amazingly simple and straightforward. And I mean, and I come from the telecom business where we said it'll never be possible to reduce telephone rates. Everybody will want $1.25 to call Europe forever, and eventually somebody came along with something from Kuwait. Bring that about. And now now you can call wherever the hell you come from for nothing. I mean, is there something we can do, or something you guys can do, or something we as people can do to try to get the banks out of their own way, or out of your way, possibly? I mean, what is the real impediment other than the banks standing in the way? I mean, is there a way to have a vonage of banks?
I mean, I think a lot of Bitcoin advocates would describe what you just did as the goal of Bitcoin, which is let's just create a completely collateral attack on the system from the outside that no one can stop. And I think that's one of the reasons that I'm, if it was not obvious, I'm not a huge enthusiast, but I'm also willing to sort of be open-minded about it. I haven't seen that, right? I've seen a lot of excitement, but not a lot of actual activity there. I think it's just too hard to disentangle yourself from the modern sort of payment infrastructure. It does so much, there are so many people involved, and the regulators, and I am a former payment regulator, the regulators actually have too much ownership in this system, right? Like the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta is too deeply involved with the ACH system to be able to stand on the outside and to say, by this date, we need everything to be done. Look, they're trying to get chip and PIN in America by October, and no one believes it's gonna happen. If you think you're going to see chip and PIN in more than 25% of your transactions here in New York, whether it's a taxi cab, whether it's a bodega, whether it's a restaurant, you're just crazy. It's not going to happen. These things, there are tons of small actors, a totally disparate infrastructure, and the regulators are too deeply involved to stand on the sidelines and sort of whip them into shape.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I think that the pattern that emerges is that today we have Bitcoin. 10, 12, 15 years ago, we had PayPal, right? Taking money out of the banking system, holding it, transacting with who you wanted to, and all of that. I think that that's generally the pattern that emerges, right? You peel off, some piece of the market, an underserved part of the market, and give them a really specific product, which is, how VoIP emerged as well. And I think that over time, one of those will take root and, will actually create. The problem I see with the banking system is that ultimately, all of those systems have to interface with actual currency at some point, and the banks have such an amazing infrastructure around protecting, at least an outwardly amazing, perceived amazing, infrastructure around protecting the value of currency and the nature of currency today. Until we buy into that level of change, it's going to be tough for these systems to take root the way I'm talking about.
Great, thank you.